This is a mad idea by your commander. Virtually a suicide mission. But it's the only chance you have to save your unit from destruction. The Red Army has launched a massive offensive on the Italian lines. You were sent to seize some nearby high ground, but the enemy got there first, and now it's swarming with Soviet soldiers. Their machine gun fire has you pinned down as they prepare to attack with their overwhelming numbers. As an Italian cavalry soldier, it's now down to you to save the day, like a knight in medieval times. Only you are facing modern soldiers armed with automatic weapons. Slowly, you ride your horses to the left of the hill, taking advantage of a Soviet blind spot. When the horses are in position, the bugler sounds the advance. And Captain De Leone yells, "Carica! Charge!" Thundering up the hill, armed only with sabres and hand grenades, you smash into the enemy's ranks. A stunned Russian soldier looks at you open-mouthed, then tries to raise his rifle, but you slash down at him with your sabre, and he screams. Falling to the floor, you continue riding, slashing at anything that moves. Up ahead, you see a machine gun crew in the dugout, repositioning their weapon so they can open fire on this new threat. You lob in a grenade, the explosion throwing a Russian over the top. Everywhere is a mass of horses, screaming men and flashing sabres. Having got over their surprise, the Soviet machine guns are now raking your ranks. It's time to retreat. As you charge down the other side of the hill, many of your comrades fall, some screaming as the bullets hit, others just slide silently from their steeds. Some horses, even though riddled by bullets, keep galloping for hundreds of meters, squirting blood at every beat of their heart, before suddenly collapsing to the ground. So many horses are now riderless as you try and regroup. Luckily, the Russians are now distracted as the rest of your unit attacks their lines. There's only a dozen of you left, but still, you charge yet again up the hill, catching the Soviets in a pincer movement. You see a Russian's face turn white with terror as your horses barrel towards him. As one, you yell, "For Italy and for the King!" I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebildet. Wollen diese 4 Jahre Nazi.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. As we've seen in the previous episodes, World War II was going terribly for Mussolini. Disasters in North Africa and Greece had left his regime little more than a satellite of Nazi Germany. In America, he was now openly ridiculed as the sawdust Caesar. Yet no lessons were learned. In a case of if at first you don't succeed, try again, he decided to join in the invasion of the Soviet Union. It's probably the least known of Italy's World War II campaigns, yet Mussolini would send far more troops into the snows of Russia than he ever did into the deserts of North Africa. His last big gamble before his overthrow seemed to pay off at first, with his army fighting well and earning grudging praise from the Germans. Yet the familiar problems of bad generals, terrible equipment, and Mussolini's own meddling set the stage for a disaster, just as Hitler's armies headed towards a city called Stalingrad. Italy didn't actually need to get involved in the Soviet campaign. Hitler didn't even tell Mussolini about Operation Barbarossa until it was already underway, let alone request any troops from him. By any standard, the last thing Italy needed at this point was another front to fight on, something almost the entire fascist leadership could agree on. The war in North Africa was going better now Rommel was in command of Axis forces, but he was always demanding more troops and supplies, while occupation duties in Yugoslavia and Greece sucked up even more troops. The economy and war industries were overstretched, barely meeting even the minimum demands placed upon them. Why then did Italy get involved? Well, sadly for Italy, only one man's voice really counted, and he thought it was a great idea. Mussolini was a terrible warlord, but he wasn't stupid. He knew that Italy's performance so far had been abysmal, and he was rapidly being relegated to just another weak ally of the Führer. He needed a victory, one that would strengthen his hand and enable him to grab some choice crumbs from Germany's victory table. His orders to the new expeditionary force he created are revealing. Quote, "We must get to the Russian front as quickly as possible. Our presence in numbers in Russia is essential. That is where Hitler believes he will win the war. Should we be absent, even the fact that I was the first one to fight communism will not count in the face of the realization that the Italians were not present in Russia." End quote. As well as burnishing his tarnished military reputation, there was also a prestige angle for the Duce. As the first fascist dictator, it would be humiliating to be left out of the great final struggle with communism. At a speech before his troops headed off to the Russian steppes, he proclaimed that, quote, "We know this enemy of mankind. 20 years ago, we scoured him from our peninsula. Now, we will purge him from the planet. Long live our continental civilization. Long live Italia." End quote. After repeated badgering from Mussolini, Hitler finally agreed to allow an Italian force to be sent to the Russian front. We often think of the war in the East as a solely German affair, but just like Napoleon's ill-fated invasion, Hitler also dragged along large numbers of Allied soldiers. There were Hungarians, Romanians, Bulgarians, Finns, and even a unit of volunteers from neutral Spain called the Blue Brigade. They would all join Mussolini's men in this epic showdown. The original Italian Expeditionary Corps, also known by its Italian initials, the CSIR, was made up of 62,000 men. Due to the vast distances involved in this campaign, it was designed to be a highly mobile and mechanized force, something the Italians had previously struggled with, as we've seen. On paper, they achieved miracles. Compared to North Africa and Greece, all the stops had been pulled out. Italian soldiers even remarked they had never seen so many vehicles before. Yet, like so many of Mussolini's achievements, if you look behind the curtain, things were not what they seemed. The vast majority of vehicles had actually been confiscated from civilian businesses. They hadn't even bothered to paint over the company names and logos. You had Italian soldiers driving into battle in trucks with Giuseppe's Pizzeria or Roman construction written on them. It really reminds me of that American plumber whose former work truck ended up being used by ISIS, complete with his company name and telephone number still on it. This meant that the Italians had 17 different kinds of light trucks and 30 for the heavy kind. Imagine trying to source spare parts for that many different kinds of vehicles. It was completely beyond Italy's supply system. They even struggled to find engineers who could repair them all. Wear and tear on the rough conditions of the Russian steppe soon put most of these out of action. They were designed for a Mediterranean climate on the relatively good roads of Mussolini's Italy. Things got so bad that the soldiers of the Torino division were forced to go by foot. They had to march over 1,300 kilometres from the Romanian border eastwards. The grumbling Italians compared themselves to the lowly foot soldiers of the Middle Ages, taken to war by their German masters who travelled comfortably on horseback. The armaments of the corps were a particular problem. Their 47mm anti-tank guns proved helpless against the massive Soviet T-34 tanks. Their rounds only slightly dented, or just ricocheted off the armour of the enemy tanks. As far as the armoured force were concerned, the Italians only had the nightmarishly bad tankettes. For a full breakdown of just how terrible these were, see episode 33. Just to summarise, they were not designed to fight other tanks. Their armour was so thin that rifle bullets could get through, and they looked like children's toys. Even their air support was a problem. They did have the Macchi C-200s, which were fine in the summer months. But when the snows came, they were next to useless, being designed with the Mediterranean theatre in mind, not the freezing cold of the Russian winter. For all the boasts about how mechanised it was, the majority of this force was foot-slogging infantry, men on motorbikes, and cavalry units. For now at least, with a big emphasis on for now, it had a truly competent general in charge, a real rarity for Fascist Italy, I'm sure you'll agree. In fact, General Giovanni Messi was probably the best Italian general of the war. He had been out of favour for his constant complaints about supply problems and shoddy equipment. But Mussolini needed a victory, so he swallowed his pride. The CSIR was sent to the Ukrainian front, and so began what I call the golden era of Mussolini's war. The first months were exhilarating as they sped along the flat steppes, with seemingly endless blue skies and fields of golden wheat. The first Italian taste of battle came as part of the Great Encircling movement by Generals Heinz Guderian and Ewald von Kleist, which ended with the taking of Kiev in September. Marching into action for a violent storm, the Vesubio Division went into battle on the 11th and 12th of August, blocking a line of retreat of Soviet units that were being encircled between the Dniester and Bug rivers. For 2 weeks, the Italian divisions held bridgeheads on the river and blocked Soviet attempts to reach it. Then, in their first major operation alone, the 2 infantry divisions fought the Battle of Prechakova, blocking the Russians' escape route west of the city and taking 10,000 prisoners for a loss of just 87 dead and 190 wounded. Overjoyed to finally have a fully Italian victory he could celebrate, Mussolini headed to the front lines with Hitler for photo opportunities with the troops. It all seemed very impressive. Most Italians were admittedly unsure why Italy was fighting the Soviet Union, but the campaign briefly enjoyed a spark of popularity as the victories rolled in. Mussolini's daughter even decided to join the Red Cross and headed to the front to work in an Italian military hospital. Yet the problems were already beginning to arise. The Italians were desperately short of trucks and went cap in hand to the Germans. All they got was an unhelpful promise of 500 trucks, 400 of which would be without tyres or engines, and there were no spare parts that could be provided. A great example of Nazi generosity there. The supply situation was also going from bad to worse. Combat units were perpetually short of fuel, ammunition, water, food, weapons, and even manpower. Even if food was available, hot or prepared food was still a luxury given the primitive state of wood-burning stoves and field kitchens. Taking advantage of the Duce's visit, Messi laid out all the difficulties he was having and begged for them to be resolved. Mussolini said nothing, seeming not to have heard a word he'd said, because ignoring a problem means it goes away. Am I right? As the Italians advanced deeper into the Ukraine, the weather began to change. Epic downpours turned the roads into seas of mud. Then the first snows of winter arrived, and the temperatures fell below freezing point. Most of Mussolini's men went to the Eastern Front wearing only the regular issue pantaloons or breeches, which, although made of wool, went only to just below the knee. The bottom of the legs were covered with socks and hobnailed boots. This was fine for the Mediterranean, but in the sub-zero temperatures of Russian winter, both proved to be totally inadequate. The hobnailed boots in particular caused large numbers of frostbite casualties, as they had the lethal combo of both letting in the snow and then retaining the water. The greatest cold weather problem facing the Italians was the effect on their equipment. The oil in the cannon's shock absorbers froze, making most of their pieces unusable. Freezing oil also disabled machine guns and especially vehicles they could ill afford to lose. Despite all this, they were better prepared than the Germans for the Russian winter. General Messi had experienced at first hand the lack of winter clothing in Greece, exasperated by the excuses and delays coming from Rome. So familiar from his time in Greece, Messi took action. He sent his interpreter off to Bucharest and Budapest to buy winter clothing and boots. However, despite Messi's requests for Russian-style felt Valenki boots, Rome would go no further than allowing him to buy a few thousand pairs of locally made quilted cloth boots. According to Mussolini, real men didn't need felt boots to deal with the cold. Not that he was volunteering to test this out, of course. In sub-zero temperatures, the Italians battled their way into the Don Basin in eastern Ukraine. It was a rude awakening as they went from the sunshine and fields full of grain and cattle to a bleak, industrial landscape covered in snow. Rather than epic encirclements and a war of movement, the fighting now resembled the future urban warfare of Stalingrad. In grimy industrial towns, they had to fight their way from house to house, building to building, room to room. The sound of bullets and far-off explosions echo in your ears, while the cold wind bites at any exposed flesh. You're a long way from Milan. As you approach the building up ahead, Giuseppe leaps over a fence and sinks up to his waist in newly fallen snow. It would be comical, but then you hear the familiar sound of a rifle crack. Giuseppe's head snaps back, and his body sinks into the snow. The lieutenant shouts out, "Sniper! Second floor!" as you open up, raking the windows with bullets. Running over, you stand to the side of the door, preparing to kick it in, when the Russians inside pepper the door with bullets. Escaping the trap, you boot in the door and then throw in grenades, advancing into the smoky interior. It is briefly quiet as you search for the defenders, when the soldier next to you suddenly screams as bullets hit him. "Contact!" you yell, as it becomes a grueling battle through the rooms, forcing the Reds back with bullets and grenades. Finally, you see 3 men running up a staircase to the next level. You open fire and 2 of them fall. But one escapes. The staircase becomes a war zone, bullets flying each way. You shout for a flamethrower to dislodge the Russians. For Giuseppe, you'll clear every floor of this building, whatever it takes. Ironically, this is the same area that is now the main war zone of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. History may not repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. The Italians were reaching the very limit of their capabilities. Their supply lines stretched to breaking point. Forward units took the town of Nikovia, but were immediately counterattacked by 3 Russian divisions. After holding them off for 5 days with little or no artillery support, and after 4 relief attempts had failed, the Italian units finally broke out and made it back to the town of Goloka, losing 130 dead and 569 wounded. The battle, fought by the relatively inexperienced men of the Torino Division in chest-deep snow and temperatures of minus 30 degrees centigrade, lasted 10 days. Hot drinks froze immediately. Food congealed as soon as it was taken out of containers. The cold froze up the working parts of the 45mm mortars and their automatic weapons, while men's hands froze to firing levers and gun barrels. The Russians launched a violent counterattack, and the battle came to a halt on the 14th of December. It had cost the Italians 135 dead, 523 wounded, and 10 missing. As outside temperatures dropped to minus 47 degrees centigrade, the troops settled into their winter positions, and Messi bombarded his superiors with requests for materials to build trenches, shelters, and barracks. His supply staff and their opposite numbers back in Rome performed minor miracles, and by mid-December, all Italian soldiers in the line and the rear echelons had full winter kit, which was more than the Germans had. Yet little did Messi know he was losing support back home. Mussolini was getting jealous of his successes, his paranoia fed by his flunkies. The knives were out for his best general. Everything seemed to be settling down for a pause, but the Russians had other ideas. They were planning a counterattack, hoping to take the Italians by surprise over Christmas. Little did they know that for once, Italian military intelligence had actually done quite well. They had told Messi all about the assault. As Second Lieutenant Rinaldi said, "We were waiting for them, and on they came by the thousand, a frontal attack by those faithless people." The Russians bit deep into the Italian positions, while defenders fought hard. One company of the Tagliamento beat off 2 Russian infantry divisions, losing all their officers in the fight. As the Italians held the line, the Germans launched a counterattack at midday, an hour and a half after Messi had requested it, which helped contain the Russian offensive. Further joint counterattacks stabilized the front, and soon 4 Soviet divisions were trapped and forced to surrender. The Christmas battle was hyped to the heavens by Mussolini. His men had fought well. Even the Italian Navy was racking up successes against the Soviets. At the request of the Germans, their mini-subs and attack motorboats appeared in the Black Sea and had a considerable impact, sinking Russian ships loaded with supplies and attacking barges crammed to the rafters with Red Army soldiers. The Italian and German naval forces were so aggressive that the Soviets were reluctant to risk their own fleet in open combat. They were stung by one attempt to intercept a German transport by a Russian heavy cruiser and a destroyer. The warships were attacked by Italian motorboats, and one torpedoed the cruiser, putting it out of action for the rest of the war. When the destroyer moved in to pursue, the nimble Italian craft dumped over a trio of depth charges that so damaged the destroyer it had to break off the pursuit. Enraged, Stalin ordered no more offensive operations without his direct orders. Famously, the German treatment of civilians on the Eastern Front was barbarous to the extreme, alienating those who originally welcomed them with open arms. The Italians wouldn't make that mistake. Messi thought the Germans were far too prone to shoot any suspects, whether innocent or guilty, fueling Soviet propaganda and increasing hatred of the invaders. He deliberately adopted a softer policy, which involved opening hospitals, pharmacies and schools, restoring churches and holding religious services. The approach did work. The Italians would be far less troubled by the partisans than any of the other Axis forces. A good example of this is the account from Alpini soldier Tullio Lisninoli, who recalled his first Christmas in Russia and his experience with the Russian people. Quote, "We Italians decided to celebrate the upcoming Christmas season with a large mass. It was too cold to hold the ceremony outside, so we decided to dig an underground church. We started to dig the hole, and after a while some Russian civilians asked us what were we doing. We told them we were digging an underground church. The next day, there were more Russians than Italians helping with the digging, as they wanted to celebrate Mass as well, so our officers gave them permission to attend. The service was conducted by our military priest and was a happy occasion, with Italians and Russians worshipping side by side." End quote. Yet before I paint too golden a picture, it was still a relationship between invader and occupied. As one Italian soldier admitted, quote, "We send our laundry to be washed and ironed. If they resist, we claim the service with force. They have to do everything we want, otherwise we'll kill them one by one." End quote. It was all going well for once, but Mussolini had to start his meddling as the campaign season came to an end. First of all, he decided to dramatically expand his forces in the USSR. From a mere 62,000, it shot up to a total strength of 250,000 men. What had once been a mere expeditionary force was now the grandly titled Italian Army in Russia, or Armia, to use its Italian initials. The problem was, they had already been struggling to supply this original force. Now these problems had just been quadrupled. Next up, he refused to put Messi in charge of this new army. Jealous of his successes and determined to cut down to size the one general who had served him so well. He wanted someone pliable, mediocre enough not to grab the limelight, a yes-man, someone like the ancient general Italo Garibaldi. Virtually no one except Mussolini thought he was up to the task. A fellow officer complained that Garibaldi, quote, "might once have been intelligent and capable, but was now in evident decline." End quote. While a German general damned him with the faint praise that he was, quote, "a nice old man, extraordinarily modest for an Italian. His military capacity was insignificant." End quote. Lastly, this new army was still desperately short of tanks and anti-tank guns. It only had 55 light tanks that were next to useless against the Soviets' massive T-34s, while their only anti-tank guns were donated by the Germans from those they seized from the Polish army at the start of the war. As the snows cleared and summer came in 1942, there was a genuine feeling that this was the year the war in the East would be won. Soldiers cheerfully talked of the victories to come. Instead, they were about to go through hell. The Germans fatefully launched Operation Case Blau, or Case Blue, the invasion of the Caucasus. Though it would end up as a battle for Stalingrad, its primary aim at the start had been to reach Baku, where the vital oil supplies Hitler lusted after were. Mussolini had wanted his new army to be part of the spearhead that drove towards Baku, so he sent large numbers of his elite mountain troops, the Alpini, to deal with the mountainous terrain. The Germans, though, had other ideas. Instead, the Italians were parked near the River Don to protect the Germans' flanks. All those elite mountain troops were stuck on the flat steppes instead, wondering why they'd been sent in the first place. As the early victories started to stall, the Italians faced their greatest test yet. On the 20th of August, 6 divisions of the Soviet 63rd Army smashed into Messi's 2 divisions on the right of the Italian front. They had been in position for only a week, during which time intensive enemy activity during the day had made it all but impossible to do much in the way of building defences. They fought bravely, but the relentless waves of Soviets was too much. One battalion lost 608 of its 680 men, cutting its way out of an encirclement. Forced to retreat, Messi set up 2 strong points in his rear to delay the Soviets. They soon became the scenes of heroism and bloodshed. At Izhbruzhensky, the Russians were massing for an attack until the last significant cavalry charge of World War II threw a wrench in their plans. As we saw in the opening dramatisation, 650 men of the Savoy Cavaliera charged a Siberian regiment of 2,000, killing 250 and taking 300 prisoners. They temporarily starved off the threat to the smaller of the 2 strongpoints. It would become a propaganda legend still celebrated today in Italy. Even the Germans were impressed, and they congratulated the Italians with a citation. Despite the heroics, the Russians kept coming. A scratch force of muleteers, drivers, cooks and dispatch riders fought the enemy house to house. Gunners defended their pieces with hand grenades and dragged them by hand to safer positions when their fuel ran out. Finally, German reinforcements arrived, and the Luftwaffe rained down bombs, driving back the Red Army. The Italian units have fought brilliantly, and unlike Greece or North Africa, there have been no mass surrenders. All this wasn't enough for Garibaldi, however. He ordered Messi's men to stop withdrawing at all costs, and warned that anyone ordering a retreat would be subject to grave sanctions. Messi obeyed under protest, objecting to Garibaldi's, quote, ungenerous evaluation of a division that had fought the enemy non-stop for 6 days with no help, and to an action that made Italian generalship look inadequate. End quote. It was arguably Italy's finest hour of the war, yet it came at a huge cost. The Italians suffered 883 dead and over 4,000 wounded. The Soler division lost 50% of its effectives, and the Swazeska needed to be practically rebuilt. Most of all, Messi could no longer bring himself to work for Garibaldi. He asked to be relieved and was sent to North Africa. With him went many of the original troops who were part of the CSIR, having served their 12 months in the Soviet Union. Red lights should have been flashing. The Italians were now without their best general and the veterans who had performed so brilliantly. It was at the worst possible time. The German Sixth Army was now battling its way into Stalingrad, while the Soviets were beginning to plan their famous counter-offensive. With Messi gone and the Italians preparing for a second winter in Russia, Garibaldi finally had free rein for his incompetence. He'd been told by the Duce that the Italian troops were too soft and needed toughening up to become fascist supermen like himself. Sadly, nodding dog that he was, Garibaldi took this to real extremes. As the Italian soldiers endured the Russian winter and morale fell, he refused to issue his stores of parmesan, cognac and chocolate to the troops, claiming they hadn't earned it. Much more serious was his decision to withhold woolen clothing as temperatures plunged down to minus 23 degrees centigrade. When he was at last persuaded by his exasperated officers that these were essentials, not luxuries, winter overcoats were limited to just 1 per soldier, with no replacements, even as thousands remained in storage. He boasted that he was turning Italians into real men. Instead, he dealt a real blow to the army's morale. It didn't help that Garibaldi was also completely blind to the rampant corruption among his inner circle. In November 1944, his chief supply officer would be accused of failing to prepare the army for winter because he was instead, quote, preoccupied himself with transferring to Italy for his personal use a Russian woman, foodstuffs, and various objects of uncertain provenance. End quote. Garibaldi also had a nasty habit of never saying no to the Germans. As Stalingrad became a meat grinder for the German army, manpower became scarce. Garibaldi kept accepting requests to expand the area the Italians were responsible for, stretching already scarce resources. Then, when the Germans asked him to build a vast defensive network of fortifications to protect the front lines, like the yes-man he was, Garibaldi calmly agreed. What he didn't say, or maybe didn't understand, was that his army didn't have the resources to do this by any stretch of the imagination. Roads were poor, railheads were up to 130 kilometres from the front line, while after the Third Battle of El Alamein, the lion's share of limited supplies were being funneled to North Africa. Even barbed wire was ridiculously hard to get hold of. They tried their best, but a few minefields was all they could produce. They were also still incredibly short of anti-tank guns, and even ammunition. Eventually Garibaldi was forced by his officers to go to the Germans and ask for help. All he came back with were vague promises that when Stalingrad fell, they would get the captured Soviet weaponry. Spoiler alert, they would never get those weapons. The result was the Italians were defending 200 miles of poorly fortified front lines, with no reserves or German support to back them up. Well done, Garibaldi. Well done. The Soviets had been paying close attention to the mess Garibaldi was making, and the similar problems which dogged the Romanian and Hungarian units, who were also guarding the Germans' flanks. They would soon take full advantage. The war in the East now began to turn against the Axis. The Soviets began Operation Uranus, and the Sixth Army in Stalingrad was suddenly besieged in the devastated city. As the Germans tried desperately to relieve them, another Soviet offensive was coming, this one heading straight for the Italians. In December 1942, Operation Little Saturn fell upon Mussolini's men. 2 Italian divisions were slammed by 15 Soviet divisions and hundreds of tanks. The Italians fought well, with the Ravenna division destroying 70 Soviet tanks, earning its commander an Iron Cross First Class from the Germans. But despite their heroics, over the next 3 days, Red Army units smashed the Italian front wide open, creating a gap 150 kilometres wide and driving 50 kilometres south to Kantomikova. This led to an embarrassing moment for Italy that the Germans would always point at to prove their allies' cowardice. When Soviet tanks appeared on the hill above Kantomikova railway station, they were mistaken for Germans until they started firing. Some 300 motor vehicles were standing with their motors running because of the cold. There was chaos as the Italians rushed to escape, some driving off overloaded, others virtually empty. Still, this wasn't the norm. Most of the army was fighting well against impossible odds. It didn't help that Garibaldi was completely out of his depth and was actually being bypassed by the Germans when it came to issuing orders. Finally, the order came to retreat, and it turned into a desperate race against time to escape the Red Army's grasp. It was a truly hellish period for the Italian army in Russia. A Soviet tanker later boasted about the carnage they inflicted on the fleeing army. Quote, An order was sent along the line. Advance! Crush! We gave it to them from both flanks. I've never seen such carnage since. We literally smashed the Italian army into the ground. It was winter, and our tanks were whitewashed for winter camouflage. And when we withdrew from battle, our tanks were red below the turrets. It was as if we'd been swimming in blood. I examined my tank. In one place there was a hand stuck to the tracks. In another, a fragment of skull. End quote. The Italian divisions had been shredded by this point. The Vesubio was down to 600 men and just 4 guns, while the Torino had lost half its men and only had 4 trucks left. In the midst of this disaster, they had further bad luck. Garibaldi began issuing orders again. He ordered the Swarsca division to destroy everything that could not be carried to safety on its remaining trucks and then retreat. When they had done so, he countermanded that order and was furious that all their artillery had been destroyed. I feel your pain, men of the Swarsca division. The retreat now began to resemble a rout, a modern version of the flight of Napoleon's Grand Armée from Russia in 1812. The cold, howling wind freezes you to the bone. The ice seemingly reaching into your very soul, while your belly rumbles with hunger. Still you stagger forward, desperate not to be caught by the Russians. All around you is chaos and madness. Some have given themselves over to hedonism, drinking themselves into a stupor with plundered cognac, while others were stupid enough to drink the antifreeze from Soviet vehicles, assuming it was alcohol, killing themselves in the process. Exhausted men collapse where they stand and move no more. Others seem to go mad. The soldier next to you suddenly sits down laughing. Pulling off his boots, he buries his bare feet in the snow and starts singing a children's song. Too tired to try and bring him back to reality, you leave him behind still singing. You have the urge to lie down and sleep, to give up, but the desire to see your family again in Napoli keeps your feet moving. This is based on real accounts of the doomed army's retreat. Casualties were predictably high. Of the 11,000 men of the Torino division who began the retreat from the Don, only 1,200 made it to safety. The 12,500-strong Vesubio division lost well over half its strength. In the midst of the defeat, one Italian force would earn the respect of both Germans and Soviets. Remember the Alpini, those elite mountain soldiers dumped on the flat Ukrainian steppe? Hitler had directly ordered them not to retreat, and now all 70,000 of them were trapped as the Soviet pincers slammed shut. They would now have to fight their way out. The order went out from their officers that the Alpini would act from now on as if they were operating in a high mountain zone. All motor vehicles were to be abandoned. As many supplies and munitions as possible were to be carried on sledges and pack animals. Frostbitten, starving, and low on ammunition, the Alpini fought their way through the snows, trying to reach the safety of the German lines. The Cannes and Julia divisions were eventually surrounded and overwhelmed by Cossack cavalry, but only surrendered after exhausting their ammunition. The Tredentina division, however, smashed their way through the last Soviet barrier and escaped. It had been an epic 200-kilometre fighting retreat, for which Radio Moscow gave the ultimate compliment, claiming, quote, "Only the Italian Alpini Corps is to be considered unbeaten on the Russian front." End quote. This mattered little to the Germans. As well as being a formidable fighting force, The German army also had a remarkable ability to blame others for its defeats. The stabbed-in-the-back myth after World War I, blaming the defeat in World War II solely on Hitler, and now Stalingrad was blamed solely on their incompetent Italian, Hungarian and Romanian allies. Their attitude was summed up by an exchange between Foreign Minister Ciano and a German officer. Asked if the Italians were taking heavy casualties, the German officer sneered back, quote, "No losses at all. They are all running." End quote. As we've seen, this was unfair. The Italians have fought well. The disaster was caused by Hitler's obsession with taking Stalingrad and the lack of support given to the Italians and other Allied armies. The Germans knew they were poorly equipped and were defending front lines that were far too long. Yet they took that gamble, and the dice came up snake eyes. This attitude filtered down to the German troops fleeing the Stalingrad disaster. There were frequent clashes between the Italians and Germans, which sometimes turned into gunfights between the two supposed allies. The German general Karl Ebel, after ranting at some Italian soldiers for their supposed cowardice and seizing their supplies, died during the retreat after an explosion in his half-track. German eyewitnesses were sure he was the victim of an Italian grenade. I can't say I blame them. The once proud Italian army in Russia had paid a terrible price. Originally, it was 250,000 men strong in Italy's best-equipped force. Now it had lost 114,520 men, all its guns, and 4/5 of its vehicles. 70,000 Italians were taken prisoner. Only 10,000 would ever return home. Mussolini had taken a big gamble sending his forces into the Soviet Union. Like so many before him, his army, and his hopes and dreams, were consumed by the Russian snows. Combined with the final Axis defeat in North Africa and the Allied invasion of Sicily, the disaster in the Soviet Union led to his downfall. Dismissed by the king and imprisoned, he was freed by a German commando raid and ruled a shrinking puppet state in northern Italy. In 1945, he was caught by Italian partisans, executed, and his body was hung up on display in Milan. General Messi was captured when Axis forces surrendered in North Africa. He then fought for the Allies as Italy changed sides. General Garibaldi's yes-man reputation didn't save him from Hitler's wrath after Mussolini's fall. He was imprisoned by the Germans and was only freed at the end of the war. The myth of the cowardly Italian soldier in World War II is untrue. Many fought bravely, often far better than the fascist regime deserved. Why then was the Italian war effort so poor? Italy had always struggled with logistics, its lack of development and unusually poor generals. Yet the majority of the blame must fall on the fascist Superman himself, Benito Mussolini. In 18 years he did little to prepare the military for such a test, overstretched what forces he did have with his inability to focus on one theatre, and promoted the worst generals who would tell him what he wanted to hear. If his soldiers often surrendered, it was because they were poorly supplied, poorly led, and often fighting for a cause they didn't understand or even believe in. Ironically, though, it's Mussolini's narrative that it was the Italian people's fault and that they failed him that has rubbed off on historians and in popular memory. We should remember that it was the other way round. Mussolini failed his people. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. Next episode, we head to the 100 Years' War for an epic tale of revenge, bloodshed, and a woman scorned. After her husband is falsely accused of treason and executed by the King of France, Jean de Clisson becomes a pirate and seeks vengeance on those who betrayed her family. See you next time for more forgotten wars.